Welcome to Classes in Session, presented by UI Health. I'm Doug Glanville. At the end of any year, we tend to reflect, a look back at what was, what is, and even looking back to frame a future. Throughout this time, sports had a river of moments that stirred our emotions. The highs and lows of competition were at the highest level we all bear witness. In between these expressions of on-field excellence is a soul search of what sports can mean to larger society, the fascinating blend of being a microcosm and a tribal instinct, of fierce loyalty, and the humble etiquette of being a good sport. The world kept spinning after the championship was won, after the gold medal was worn. The lessons run deeper than needing to throw a tighter spiral. It implores us to look at the possibility of greater unity beyond the common banner, or at least ask how common ground and fair play could be off the court as well as on. Today, we consider the impact of a year and what needles were moved, regardless of the direction. We ask if our nature to commemorate a calendar year is enough to fully understand what happened through sport, the incomplete mission started, the long haul of change that finally ended in the middle of a year by happenstance. It matters when this all happened, the state of politics, the economics of our standing, the power in power. Today, we discuss this year with an incredible trio. Joon Lee, MLB writer and contributor for ESPN and ESPN.com, with deep insights on the intersection of sport and culture. Christina Kahrl, current sports editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, co-founder of Baseball Prospectus, and former editor and colleague at ESPN. And Dave Zirin, prolific author on sports and society with numerous biographies on figures of impact, editor of The Nation, weekly column, The Edge of Sports, with his podcast. Let's get to class. When we look back in time, we find moments and checkpoints that were turning points. History and what we choose to preserve stems from what happened next, as we try to make sense of what it all means despite our inability to recall the future. In the role of sports in social change, we still are limited by boundaries, often framed around the finite nature of our own time and space. Still, as humanity, we get to chain together these markers one after the other until we cover some ground, or until we see a pattern. We note when those moments and people of deeper consequence will last, and when they will transcend generations. But with each tick of the clock, we see anew. Our memories tap the annual reminders and find that sports commemorate transformational shifts, usually on the field of play, but also through its figures and the times when it led society towards change. We therefore note when Jackie Robinson broke into baseball, or when Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs, or when Kathy Freeman won the 400-meter race to celebrate the first Aboriginal Australian to win a gold medal at the Olympics. We note holidays and birthdays of those lost in their sacrifices, or memorials to those who served. It all gives us a chance to pause, recognize, and reset. The presence of that history and the identities wrapped in it may have simply represented change by someone new and different finally reaching the podium. Yet we search for enduring meaning to ensure these were not one-off moments. Not only did they bring change, but change rippled beyond sport and became consequential, transformational even. Like any year, this past year we saw a convergence of athletes, athletics, and the push for social change. It appeared in forms of pioneers, policies, name changes in power, politics and investment, social norms, customs, and whistleblowers. This opened up deeper conversations, but also made us search for the formula for enduring change without the luxury of time, but through our ability to connect dots to our past and make projections, heavily relying on the interest and commitment of those who will come next. It leads us to so many questions about impact and where we are in the flow of forces for change, especially given there is so much natural resistance to change built by the status quo. For now, we know when certain agents of change shake the foundation of the familiar. We are never quite sure whether that foundation will crumble to be rebuilt with all of us in mind, or whether it will sway with the change and only allow for cosmetic change until another year elapses. Either way, we are insecure, unsure of what will be rebuilt, while the real concern is losing the value of our memories, which help us teach, learn, and at times avoid repeating the same mistakes. We're very fortunate to be joined by this esteemed panel. We have Joon Lee, we have Dave Zirin, and Christina Kahrl. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. I'm very excited to sort of look at this because we're approaching the end of the year. And so much perspective is coming from this. So in context, we're looking at this year through the lessons learned about what sports has done to impact society. And what I'll do is I want to start with you, Christina, because if you were looking at this past year, so much is going on, and you break it down in a summary of sorts. Like, how do you look at sports and society through 2022?
I mean, right now, I think that, perhaps the defining topics right now are really about, on some level, about gender. And for me, at least, as far as looking at it from conversation about the rising prominence and I think rising level of attention on women's sports, good and bad, and particularly good in the sense of, again, the way in which we think and feel and have elevated and give due respect to, whether it's in women's soccer, everything that's going on in the WNBA and the rise of that league, some of the tremendous stuff we're seeing in college sports. But then, there's obviously, I think, a lot of conversation around where do trans people fit into sports. That's kind of like, I'd say, the big headline right now is basically what are the future of what's the future of women's sports? What is the future of trans participation in sports?
So I want to turn to you, Dave, because you framed so much around the year in review often. In fact, your columns I use quite a bit in class. What has been so notable to you when you look at 2022?
I think 2022 is going to be remembered in the world of political sports or sports and politics on two distinct fronts. The first is that I think 2022 will be remembered forever as the year of sports washing, as the year where these big global events took place in authoritarian countries. First, of course, the Winter Olympics in China, and now, of course, the World Cup in Qatar. I'll say this, 2020 was not 2 years ago, even if it was 2 years ago. It's been a long time since 2020 when we were talking about this explosion of athlete activists, being part of what was at the time, after the police killing of George Floyd, the largest movement of demonstrators in the history of the United States. And athletes were a part of that. And for a lot of us, that was so thrilling to see this coming together. But at 2022, if you think about things like January 6th or these recent elections or the attack on trans kids, it's like, where's the athletic community stepping forward as one in defense?
So I want to turn this to Joon Lee. I'm curious to see how you perceive 2022 in the year of activism.
I think that we're headed towards a future when the North America is hosting the World Cup, confronting a lot of the systemic issues internationally that America is projecting out into the world, whether it's war crimes against other countries or the systemic imprisonment of Black people in America. I mean, there's so many different issues. I think to tie everything together, too, we're also seeing the beginning of the full impact of player empowerment and having athletes' voices matter, not just on sports matters, but political matters and cultural matters.
Yeah, and I think within that, one of the things that we talk a lot about is you mentioned, all of us have mentioned around identity being so central to change or the challenges that we face as a society, but also where sports can play a role. So I'm curious your opinion about, working within a sort of collective benefit. And I'll start with you, Dave.
I think, how do we, in fact, transcend identity to create an atmosphere of solidarity, which I called it common sense solidarity. I think there are other instances of common sense solidarity, like racism is a bad thing. Anti-Semitism is a bad thing. These are common sense things that hopefully can transcend identity and create solidarity. But I think it's so important, you made this point, like that the sports world does not exist in this hermetically sealed vacuum away from the real world. And so while we might decry, and I might decry, the absence of forward political thinking among athletes in 2022, I also can't ignore the fact that that's been a broader sentiment in our society, of people feeling a sense of hopelessness, a sense of despair, of people being open to certain ideas that a lot of us thought lived in the dustbin of history.
I just want to circle back to something you said, Doug, as far as really focusing on identity. I mean, if you talk to LGBTQ athletes, if you talk to trans athletes, and how they self-identify, a lot of the time, in fact, every one of them that I've asked, they identify first as an athlete, not as, a gay person or a trans person necessarily. That being an athlete is so intrinsic to their sense of self and who they are and their competitive drive. And that gets to the heart of what I think, sports is really about, which is, and the unifying power of sports, that we would all be focused on shared goals or shared drive for personal excellence on the field.
Coming up, more with our esteemed panel as we examine if 2022 was a year of progress or a harbinger of difficulties to come. We'll be right back on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, as we continue with Joon Lee, Christina Kahrl, and Dave Zirin. I want to ask about Brittany Griner, and we're thinking about talk about a WNBA legend, and being free finally, right, at a certain period of time. But there's so much conversation, and understandably so. But what do you think is most missed about that story?
I think Dave touched on this earlier, but the way that certain portions of the sports community were really quiet about what was happening with Brittany Griner, even though this is a international political situation with very, very high stakes and families involved, and Brittany Griner's partner going on national television, basically begging the White House to do anything. That was absolutely heartbreaking to see.
I think the outrage, is really kind of, like the people who are now, years, Paul Whelan's been there for a long time. And, of course, everybody wants Paul Whelan to also be brought back from Russia. But the people who basically sat on their hands 4 or 5 years and have not said boo about Paul Whelan's predicament about being there, but suddenly are outraged that the United States did anything to bring Brittany Griner back. That's not about that. That's performative patriotism. I think it's about, the fact that she's a Black queer woman, and that upsets a certain segment of this country. And they don't want to see the United States government intervening on behalf of somebody who's Black and queer.
And many of these athletes are connected to not only just a nation, a group, but also a league. And I'm curious to get your sense of what have the leagues been able to do, or in terms of, if you look at their history, was 2022 any different, or was it an advancement or growth for leagues in terms of how they approach these challenges, right? We mentioned the silence, whether the NBA with Kyrie Irving. Are there other examples you could cite about leagues' responsibility and what they're doing or currently trying to do? I'll start with you, Joon.
I think that in baseball specifically, I'm starting to see a culture shift where one of the incidents that really jumped out to me this year was the fallout around Josh Donaldson calling Tim Anderson Jackie Robinson, and the way that baseball actually responded to it in a serious way. People didn't just kind of brush it off as a distraction. Tim Anderson's a pretty polarizing guy in baseball. Josh Donaldson's also a very polarizing guy in baseball. And Donaldson seemed to assume that there was a connection between the two of them that didn't exist, as people in Chicago obviously know. But the thing that I thought was really interesting was the way that the Yankees, historically in baseball, the most culturally conservative organization in the sport, came out in full force saying, we side with Tim here, we don't side with Josh Donaldson. I thought it was interesting just because it was an issue around race that I think baseball would have been afraid to confront a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I got the biggest bright spot for me in what has otherwise been a very distressing year. I thought the reaction by Manfred to the minor league players saying union was very encouraging, because when that whirlwind took place, and I reported on it a lot, the response by Major League Baseball, which of course recently contracted a number of minor league teams, could have been scorched earth. And instead, it was much more like Rob Manfred was like, okay, this genie is way out of the bottle. There's really nothing I can do about this other than say, you got me.
Christina, I know, and you're sitting in San Francisco as the marketplace by which you're observing, and certainly close contact with a very specific group of teams. So is there anything that you saw in terms of whether the local team's response or just how the league has sort of responded within your marketplace that stood out for you?
Well, I think we've been kind of like, dealing with some very larger questions about essentially teams as corporate citizens, and like how their behavior, particularly when it's associated with the bottom line, or when they, like the 49ers have taken a very active position politically, and they've taken it in a way that's effectively a different variation on a sports washing theme, that they have tried to take over the city council of Santa Clara and have achieved that. And they dress it up as like that they're about improving diversity and inclusion in the city council, when it's really turning out to be about making sure they can elect people who are going to wash their hands of like the city's oversight of the stadium, essentially the 49ers mismanagement of Levi's Stadium.
Our look back at the year that was continues next on Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health. Welcome back to Classes in Session with Doug Glanville, presented by UI Health, and our year-end discussion with Joon Lee, Christina Kahrl, and Dave Zirin. Well, since at this point we're looking at New Year's around the corner. And of course, at that point, we think about resolutions that we may only keep for 2 weeks, go to the gym, whatever it is. So I want to go around the horn here and find out your thoughts about the resolution for sport, and its role in larger society.
I think that one of the things I'm personally going to be thinking about in regards to sports is thinking about sports' role in the larger geopolitical context in the future and in the present. Because I think one of the things that really stuck out to me about the way that Kyrie Irving responded to all the criticism that he received about his comments in the last couple of months was that he vacillated between the stance of my voice matters and also I'm just an athlete who actually cares about what I think. Like there was almost this there's this contradicting thought that he had that I thought was so fascinating, where he clearly was trying to process the fact that his words have an impact on a lot of people. And that's I think there was part of him from what he was saying that almost underestimated how far and wide reaching his comments on all this and every single post that he posts on social media, the effect that it might have on people.
I mean, I'm looking at history. And I'm looking at the way the AAU in the 1930s organized against sending an Olympic team to Hitler's Germany in 1936, or the way that athletes tried to organize a counter Olympics, a People's Olympics in Spain in 1936. And that, of course, ended because of the Spanish Civil War. Why am I thinking about that? And why am I talking about the Spanish Civil War on your show? It's because I think we're living in a moment where athletes standing up to these ideas, the worst ideas in our society, the most dangerous ideas in our society, is going to become a must in terms of part of how we build a movement to put these hatreds at bay. I mean, in my lifetime, Joon spoke about in his lifetime, I can't believe he's 27. I feel like I've been reading Joon for 2 decades. But and that's a compliment. But like what Joon was saying, as far as like it being a generational conversation, as far as athletes being political, this is the first time in my lifetime where words like Nazi, fascist are part of like a conversation. Like we thought we were done with that. So the fact that it's roared back makes me want to see athletes take a stand against it and be part of a tradition of anti-fascist athletes that goes back 100 years.
And Christina, I guess the resolution of all resolutions, 2023, you're looking at sports. What do you hope for, and what do you see that sports should commit to?
I guess my question is that, like if we're going to have a conversation about where trans people fit into sports, let's be honest about it. We've seen, a school district like LAUSD has had trans inclusion in K through 12 sports for 14 years. They've graduated 1 million kids, literally, in that time. Did we see a takeover in girls' sports by trans athletes? No, we did not. And instead, it's just kids going in PE, kids being kids and playing school sports. It does not lead to this massive, like destruction of women's sports or inclusion. And so, like, again, if we in the media in particularly embrace our responsibility to shed sunlight instead of focusing on all the heat that people want to generate around this subject, let's instead shed some light and really embrace that trans people have a place in sports too,
and shed some love. And I want to thank you, all of you, for this incredibly insightful panel discussion. One line that, Christina, I love that you, or at least you're attributed as a quote, you say, "For whose benefit do I exist?" I thought that was really deep. And I think the idea that we have an opportunity, and we're all in the space of sports where we have not only the power of observation, but the ability to contextualize. And I'm thankful that all of you make such an effort to contextualize the sport with honesty, but also in a way that elevates the sport to bring people together and to allow us an opportunity to honor history through a true lens, because that's the best way we can learn and go forward. A year is never enough time to fully understand the speed of change. We are always searching to declare being on the other side, searching for meaning, knowing we are only granted limited time to figure it out. Those of us who love sports embrace its power to forge memories, moments that take us back to victory or disappointment, family and teammates of our yesteryear. It stays with us. Yet there's no denying its ubiquitous presence, swirling around every space in global society, and therein lies the opportunity, engaging something that touches everyone. By reaching everyone, we all want to feel included, like the line of kids waiting to be chosen for the team. It is important to be chosen first, but maybe more important is to be chosen at all. Then we can enjoy the simplicity of just being an athlete or a fan that loves the game, knowing the game loves them no matter who they are. This is the foundation of how sport can be larger than life, the chance to bring everyone in close, transcending the limits we impose on each other, bigger than a checked box, bigger than a singular identity. It's great for a few hours, but better for a lifetime. I'm Doug Glanville. I'll see you in class.